The world watched as Trudeau crushed political dissent and stamped out a peaceful and democratic protest. How will this impact Justin Trudeau's reputation at home and abroad? I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. So as quickly as it began, as quickly as the Trudeau government implemented this Emergency Act, we learned on Wednesday afternoon that the emergency was over. Trudeau lifted it a mere 36 hours after it was voted on and approved in the House of Commons. It's sort of all swept under the rug in the past, and Trudeau would like to move on, I'm sure, as quickly as possible, putting this disastrous episode of Canadian history in his past. And he might get away with that. He might get away with that domestically. There may be enough liberal progressive voters who were just sick and tired of the blockades. They were sick and tired of the protests. They didn't like the truckers, and they wanted that story to go away. Perhaps they're even happy with Justin Trudeau's use of force. I did notice a lot of people on social media sort of thanking Trudeau and praising him for his use of this Emergency Act. So perhaps he'll get away from it, get away with it domestically, but I'm not so sure about it when it comes to an international level, when it comes to the reaction of people watching from the outside. And to help me walk through the international reaction and perspectives from abroad, I am joined by Kaveh Shahrooz. Kaveh is a lawyer and human rights activist. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute Centers for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad. Kaveh previously worked as a senior policy advisor over at Global Affairs Canada. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and the University of Toronto. Kaveh, it is great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
So first, Kaveh, why don't you tell me a little bit about your reaction, your impression overall of the convoy and how Justin Trudeau handled it?
So, I think my impression may be a little bit different than the average viewer of your show or listener of your podcast. I am very much a believer in vaccination. I think, vaccine mandates have their place, though not probably as widespread as they are. So I watched the protest and the content of what they were arguing for with a little bit of skepticism, I'll be honest. But I was really mystified by how our Prime Minister and our media reacted. What they questioned at the outset wasn't really the arguments of the truckers and the protesters. It was much more just trying to invalidate their point, calling them racists and white supremacists and sexist and so on, which I think is an unfair way of dealing with the protesters. And, I think what we saw was just a failure of government in various levels and a tremendous government overreach with respect to the Emergencies Act. I'm glad that they've decided to revoke it, but it was never really should have been invoked in the first place.
Well, it's so weird, the timeline, because by the time Justin Trudeau declared the emergency, the main sort of artery that people were concerned with, the Ambassador Bridge, had already been cleared using existing laws. And then they canceled debate on the Emergencies Act because the Emergencies Act had already been implemented, and the police action caused by the Emergency Act made it apparently too hectic or chaotic for them to even be able to enter Parliament, which I think is a farce to begin with, because we had a reporter on the ground, Andrew Lawton. He said that on Friday, the activities were happening over by the Westin and the Chateau Laurier, which is on a different side of Parliament Hill. The Parliament was pretty open on Friday. It wasn't until Saturday that the police action was there. So the whole thing was sort of a politicized attempt to, I suppose, avoid scrutiny. By the time they finally got around to voting on it, Kaveh, it was Monday evening. And at that time, the protests had been cleared completely. And so it didn't even make sense as to why they implemented it. And a mere 36 hours later, again, they did remove it. What is your reaction to the sort of, or what are your thoughts on the reaction here at home, here in Canada? It seems like a lot of people on social media, a lot of liberals are applauding Trudeau for this use of Emergency Act. A lot of journalists really spinning and justifying it, saying that it was righteous and it was necessary. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've been incredibly disappointed with our media, which hasn't treated the protest fairly. I don't expect them to support the protesters. I don't expect reporters to be supporting any protest, really, of any cause. They ought to be reporting it fairly. But it seemed like there was very much a particular narrative that the major broadcasters wanted to push. If you read, CBC, CTV, whatever, the line from day one was that this was an illegitimate protest. This was a racist protest. This was a violent protest. And they cherry picked information to support all that. But by and large, I think what we saw was that this was a non-violent protests. There were not really very many arrests. Even the leaders of the convoys that have been arrested, I think it's conspiracy to mischief. I think that's largely a charge, which is not a tremendously significant or violent charge that's been brought forth. So it's been disappointing. With respect to the people on social media that are praising Trudeau, I put out a question on Twitter a while ago, and I asked, can somebody explain to me why we needed the emergency, like the things that were being done by police? What is it that the Emergencies Act allowed us to do that we couldn't do before? And I don't think I saw anybody, even the people that were praising Trudeau, be able to give me a good answer to that. And I think exactly as you mentioned, like much of the protest was over by the time the Emergencies Act was invoked. I don't think any of the powers that the government tried to grab for itself were actually needed. So it was really, I think, a disappointing day for a lot of our institutions, our government, and our media.
Kaveh, you come from an oppressive authoritarian country that punishes political dissident. I'm wondering, when you look at the way that, I mean, you mentioned the charges that were laid against Tamara Lich and the fact that she was denied bail. When you see that happening, does it concern you at all that there is political retribution going on in our systems and in our institutions here in Canada?
It does concern me. So first of all, I do want to avoid some of the hyperbolic rhetoric that I see floating around, right? So I don't think what happened, even though some people might like to think of it that way, I don't see what happened in Ottawa as being, an example of, totalitarianism, or this is not what happens in China or Iran or whatever. Those countries are far, far worse. There's far less room for dissent. But this was not our shining day. Let's just say that. I think the protesters, by and large, because their political message wasn't one that our political elites and our media like, they were portrayed in a very negative light. They simply weren't listened to. They were dismissed, and I think the response, as we've discussed, was a very politicized one. I think this convoy could have been dealt with in many different ways. Had their message been one that our political elite supported, I think they would have perhaps met with them, maybe expressed some support for them, at least given them a meeting and try to listen to them rather than just try to deal with it in a confrontational way as they ultimately did.
It seemed very un-Canadian to me. It seems to me that Canadians are known internationally as being good-natured, friendly, willing to listen. The whole quip about how Canadians say sorry constantly all the time, even if it wasn't their fault. That's the sort of quintessential Canadian. And even Justin Trudeau, I had John Kay on my podcast, I think it's 2 weeks ago now, and he talked about how, the young Justin Trudeau, when he was first running for office, he would go and he would listen to even separatists in his riding. He comes from an area in Montreal that has a large separatist faction, and he was really open and willing to listen. And to me, I'm not a Trudeau fan. I never have been. But that point that he used to be willing to engage and listen to people, even though he disagreed with, it seems like part of the issue here was that we had a group of people who worked throughout the pandemic, right? They didn't have the luxury of doing what you and I are doing, which is working from home and going on Zoom calls and carrying on with our lives in a digital way. These people had to get up every morning and go face the reality of living in a world with COVID. They had to do grueling work, make sure that we could get food and supplies and gasoline and all these really important things. It seems like this entire class of people have been taken for granted. And the fact that they showed up in Ottawa, at the time when they showed up, they had a great deal of support. You saw Canadians lining freeways and hosting big potlucks to feed the truckers and to support them, lining the overpasses, Canadian flags everywhere. It seemed like a little bit of a positive moment of a political uprising, saying, let's thank and pay attention and give a due hearing to the working class people that kept our country and our economy going for the last 2 years. And it's just a disrespect that Trudeau showed them by immediately treating them like they were scum, basically, that they were unworthy of a hearing. To me, that was so un-Canadian.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think, if you take a step back and look at it, as an outsider, if you're not kind of mired in all these discussions, let's say you don't live in Canada and you're just kind of observing it, you see two things. One, you see Justin Trudeau, the story that had been told about him in the progressive media, the liberal media for many years. That story fell apart, right? Like the story was Justin Trudeau is a man of the people. He listens to the people. He likes to be inclusive. And I think the world saw kind of what we Canadians that have observed this closely have seen for many years, which is that that story is actually not true. There is a limit to what Trudeau is willing to tolerate. There are classes of people that he's just not willing to listen to. if their views clash with what he he's pretty self-righteous, and if he thinks that you have abhorrent views, he simply will not engage with you, which is I think rather unfortunate. And I think the second thing that people saw was this class distinction that you're describing. Suddenly there were working class people that don't have the luxury of working off of Zoom, showing up to the nation's capital, demanding respect. And suddenly there were again media and political elites who have managed to weather this pandemic pretty well, not taken very many losses, frankly, in terms of haven't taken much of a financial hit, and they were sneering and laughing at working class people. And I think that class distinction really was sharpened as a result of the convoy protests. I think it was hard to look at it and not see that class conflict brewing just underneath the surface in Canada.
I completely agree, and it still surprises me to see journalists and sort of talking heads on CBC in the Globe and Mail, dismissing this idea, saying that no, it didn't have anything to do with class. No, these protesters really were truly dangerous, and not even sort of stopping to take pause and take stock of the situation, just out of hand rejecting it, which to me will lead to much more of these kind of problems in the future. I want to shift a little bit, Kaveh, to talk about the international reaction, because we're in our Canadian bubble and we see things every day in, day out. Perhaps we get like too deep into it. You mentioned that people who pay a lot of attention. We know that the Trudeau is a charade mostly, and that he's not this open, inclusive person. He's very rigid in his ideology. Let's talk about some of the foreign reaction. I know that there's been a lot of American Republican politicians who have really been following this closely, really concerned about just some of the practices, seizing bank accounts, shutting down the GoFundMe account. Some of them are using very hyperbolic language, like you mentioned, calling Trudeau a tyrant and a dictator. But some of them are making strong points as well about the dangerous use of power, especially when it comes to seizing bank accounts. Let's talk about American reaction first. What do you think of the idea that Justin Trudeau has become sort of political fodder for the right in the U.S., and they're kind of using him as a punching bag to warn about what the Democrats would do if they had more power?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's happening. Frankly, if I worked for the Prime Minister, I don't know if I would welcome that or try to fight against it. I'm not really sure. I mean, I think there is some advantage in Trudeau portraying himself as a punching bag of the American right, of Fox News, because I think that strengthens his standing with his own supporters here at home, who see any attack from the American right as a sign that you're good and righteous. But I think I am not really one that listens a lot to Fox News. Again, I'm on your show. I love listening to what you do, but I think my politics may be a little bit different than your average viewer and listener. But I think it is concerning that we are being portrayed so negatively in the United States, at least among 50% of the population there sees us as sliding towards undemocratic practices. I think that's a really dangerous road for us to go down. I don't think Justin Trudeau is really anybody to blame but himself. Like, he could have really handled this differently. We saw tweets from sitting members of Congress calling Canada tyranny, welcoming refugees from Canada and so on. A lot of it was hyperbolic, but I think it speaks to the fact that people are realizing Justin Trudeau is not all that he's cracked up to be, and that Canada is not the nice hunky-dory place where everybody gets along, that there are real tensions here, and that we have a government that inflames those tensions.
Certainly, and it's not just the American political right, Kaveh, because I've noticed comments from British MPs in the UK, in Australia as well. Nigel Farage, leader of the Brexit Party, says, "I can't quite believe Trudeau's behaviour. I knew it was bad, but this is frightening." John Redwood, who's a Conservative MP, said Canada's PM is dividing his country by using strong-arm tactics against freedom protesters. In a democracy, leaders need to find a way to allow protests or listen to protesters while keeping roads open. To me, that seems very reasonable, and I sort of welcome this sort of outside criticism, because perhaps Trudeau is too ensconced in his partisan world to listen to conservative opposition. He's not going to listen to the truckers. He might revel from Fox News and Republican condemnation. But I think sort of sober criticism from serious-minded officials, certainly in the UK. But we also saw a member of the European Parliament, Romanian MEP, commenting on this. Some other sort of big leaders. Do you think any of that will get through, or do you think Trudeau is just too again ensconced in his own?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Trudeau necessarily cares a lot about what people outside his bubble say. That's just the impression I have. I mean, I have no line into Justin Trudeau or his people. I suspect though that he's getting bad advice, and he's getting a very limited worldview. What I want to talk about is something else slightly though, which is like, on Twitter, a lot of politicians, especially on the right, have spoken up. But it's actually, I'm actually perhaps in some ways less interested in what people are saying on Twitter and thinking about what somebody observing Trudeau, in Beijing or in Moscow or in Tehran would think. Observing Trudeau's reaction to the protest tells them a couple of things. One is that he simply doesn't have a good handle on what's happening in his country, right? Like we just saw chaos in our country for three weeks. Prime minister who barely took action, who just demonized a part of his population. And then because he hadn't done very much and couldn't get his act together, suddenly decided to overreach, did it for a couple of days, realized that it was ridiculous and it was polling very badly. So he just pulled back. So we just end up looking clownish on the world stage. So if you're sitting in Beijing and you look at Canada, and Canada just simply does not look like a serious country. And this is just one data point, right? There have been several years worth of data points of Canada just not being a serious country, not having a serious foreign policy, not taking a particularly tough line on any of these bad regimes around the world. So I think that's thing one that they see. And the second thing that they see is, look, this is a perfect justification now for us to crack down in whatever way we want. And we've seen sort of hints of that yesterday. I think I saw a tweet from the Chinese embassy in Ottawa, if I'm not mistaken, talking about how the crackdown was terrible and we would never behave this way in China, which is ridiculous. But it's the kind of thing that dictatorial regimes look for to condemn democratic ones. And I think, we, Canada, the government of Justin Trudeau, just handed a win to these dictatorial regimes because they can incorporate that in all their speeches in international fora and point to Canada and say, look at what you did to those truckers. Look at the power grab that you just engaged in. Why, what standing do you have to criticize us? And I think that puts us in a much, much weaker position. This just simply from a foreign policy perspective wasn't really thought through.
That's true. How can Canada stand here on a high horse and claim that we are the spokespeople and the advocates for global freedom and democracy when we use that? Yeah, you're right. There is a I'm not sure if this is the same one, but someone who's working for a state broadcaster in China said, so Hong Kong cannot invoke the national security law against violent petrol bomb throwing mobs, but Canada's Trudeau can invoke emergency powers to crack down on peaceful pro-freedom protesters. So it makes him seem quite hypocritical. I got to ask you about this one, Kaveh. Former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. I haven't heard about him in a while. I know he used to make a lot of press and he used to say pretty outrageous things on Twitter. He was always the person that anytime someone would get kicked off of Twitter, it's like, wait, you're allowing Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who's like calling for genocide or whatever he's calling for, but you're kicking off this guy. So anyway, he jumped in and bashed Trudeau. He says the violent crackdown on Freedom Convoy has nothing to do with freedom of speech or human rights. How coercion could be related to liberty and freedom of choice, freedom for truckers.
So first of all, to your readers and listeners, I urge you, if you do not follow Ahmadinejad on Twitter, please do so. He's regularly quoting rap lyrics, talking about U.S. sports. It's a very, very bizarre Twitter feed. But yeah, I mean, amidst all this Holocaust denial and so on, he decided to take a shot at Justin Trudeau. Obviously, I don't put a lot of stock in what Ahmadinejad says. He's a bit of a clown, and he himself should be charged for the way he reacted to protests in Iran. But I think, again, this speaks to the point I was making earlier, which is like there is also an optics war happening that we ought to be cognizant of. Right? How do we look to the outside world? And we look terrible to the outside world. We looked dictatorial. There is no comparison between what happened. I want to stress this, between what happened in Ottawa and what happened in Tiananmen or what happens in Tehran when governments crack down. These are different things. But we look bad. We look terrible. And we should have thought about how this would be interpreted in capitals across the world. And I think next time Iran takes the stage at the UN or the UN Human Rights Council, when we criticize them, they will turn around and say, look, you had peaceful protesters in your street and you froze their accounts and you attacked them. Who are you to say anything to us? And I think we end up looking silly as a result. So again, as I said, nobody thought this through beyond sort of very petty parochial domestic politics.
You're right. You're right. It was like a knee jerk reaction. It was like Trudeau didn't really do anything. The police kept the peace on the ground in Ottawa for the first 2-3 weeks. Trudeau kind of poured gasoline on the fire by name calling and refusing to meet. And then all of a sudden, it was such a huge situation that he needed to use like the biggest tool in his toolbox, which wasn't even in his toolbox. He had to go out and invent a new tool to use it. You mentioned the freezing of bank accounts, and I want to talk a little bit about this because to me, when I think of people who support Trudeau, I think of the sort of young entrepreneurial class, people who are interested in technology, people who go out and start companies and might be big into like the crypto world. So I've been really amused and interested to see more and more tech leaders in Canada and around the world outright condemning Trudeau, not just condemning him, but talking about the very dangerous precedent that he is setting for other wannabe dictatorial regimes in using these tools. So, we had 200, the government has confirmed 208 bank accounts have been frozen. That's more bank accounts than the US government froze after 9/11, right? And there was no due process. There was no, no recourse, essentially. They just froze your accounts. Some of them are being refrozen now. We don't know exactly why some people's accounts are being frozen. Some people claim that their accounts were frozen, even though they're not part of the convoy. They just donated to the convoy. So we have the co-founder of Ethereum talking about how this is just really difficult to wrap its head around. You had the founder, one of the founding COO of PayPal, saying Justin Trudeau just created a caste of economic untouchables. Can we stop this dystopian policy from taking hold in America? I noticed quite a few. Obviously Elon Musk has been commenting on this sort of since day one, but I'm wondering what. First of all, what you think about this in terms of Justin Trudeau and some of the core people who might have supported him in the past, but also the sort of precedent that this may set for future leaders trying to go down this dark path.
Yeah, quite frankly, I mean, I think when it comes to the Emergencies Act, this is the story that we should be focused on, right? A lot of the other stuff, I think, is maybe just noise, but this is the truly dangerous stuff. And as you mentioned, some people in Silicon Valley and elsewhere are pointing it out, and we ought to be listening to this really carefully. The idea that in our increasingly cashless society, you can simply freeze people out because they expressed a political idea you didn't like. I think we just got the first taste of it. And it's an incredibly, incredibly dangerous sign of what's potentially to come. And I think it's all the reason for us to speak up against the Emergencies Act, its invocation, and now demanding an inquiry into why it happened and what the mechanisms were by which the government decided to freeze, or the banks decided to freeze, certain bank accounts. Because this is a sign of creating, as you mentioned, I think David Sachs was the one that wrote this in Barry Weiss's Substack, of creating a social outcast class, people who have undesirable ideas that we just don't want to deal with. And the way to do that is just to freeze them out. They can't go and set up their own financial institutions, right? The idea had always been, well, if you can't speak on this platform, you can go to some other platform. But if you freeze people's bank accounts, if you freeze their cryptocurrency, they become homeless. They can't pay their mortgage. They can't do any of the things they're supposed to do. This is an incredibly dangerous sign. As I mentioned, this is, people have been warning about a social credit system to come that, countries like China are implementing. I don't think we're quite there yet, but this does not bode well for what's to come in our future. And there was an op-ed in the New York Times by Ross Douthat, and he was talking about, Canada can be understood as kind of the incidents in Ottawa can be understood as a battle between the practicals and the virtuals. The practicals being, the truck drivers, and the virtuals being people that work on the knowledge economy. And this is probably the most potent weapon of the knowledge economy, right? Being able to freeze people's assets and make them non-persons in our economy. And talk about a class war. That is something that the working class ought to be really, really worried about. And those of us who sympathize, I'm not working class, but I certainly sympathize with the plight of the working class. We ought to be fighting back against this, because this can go down a very dangerous path.
Well, it's so true, and that was an excellent op-ed that Ross wrote. But even more than that, it's sort of like taking cancel culture and like applying it throughout your entire life. It's not just like, oh, you no longer get a voice on Twitter. It's like you don't get a house anymore. I mean, it's really scary the jump there, but it's using the same sort of logic of like,
I've worked for big corporations. I don't know if I want to outsource adjudication of these issues to some compliance officer in some bank somewhere, right? Like they are just not equipped to deal with this. And anytime you raise this issue, I think the standard answer is, well, the courts will eventually adjudicate. It's like, well, have you tried working through the court system? Like, you will spend years and years trying to clear your name or unfreeze your bank accounts. Lives are going to be ruined in this process. And this is an incredibly dangerous tool in the hands of governments that want to abuse it. Next time, and I say this to my friends that are left of center, that are liberals, like next time the conservatives take over, you may not like who's being targeted by these same rules. So if you don't want the conservatives to use it, maybe you should put that weapon down right now. But anyway, I think this is something that's obviously we got a sign of it in Canada. We're going to see it increasingly, I think, in different democratic countries, and all we can do is just fight back.
Scary stuff there, Kaveh. Well, thank you so much for helping us break this down and understand. I want to ask you a final question. I saw you write on Twitter a couple of days ago that you think that this will have a long-term negative effect for Trudeau. That it just fundamentally changed the way that people see him. Do you still feel that way, or do you think Trudeau's going to recover from all this?
I do, and I noticed that you responded and you disagreed with me, and I think this is a healthy disagreement to have. I think ultimately I don't hold Justin Trudeau in particularly high regard. I think he's a man who has a very good sense of optics, and he has sold himself, and he has bolstered himself at home with his reputation abroad. And his reputation up until recently has been stellar abroad, as he's this good-looking, young, energetic man who's very progressive and whatever. And this incident just made him look very petty and mean. And I think it's really difficult for him to recover his golden boy reputation abroad. And if he doesn't have that at home, he ends up looking much weaker and much less interesting. And I think he's just finally exposed for who he is, which is kind of a shallow and petty man.
Okay, well, I'll agree with that. We can end it there. Kaveh Shahrooz, Macdonald Laurier Institute. Thank you so much for joining the Candice Malcolm Show.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Candice.
All right, thanks for tuning in. I'm Candice Malcolm. This is the Candice Malcolm Show.